Hi, dear friends and cultural creatives. Bruce Lipton here. I want to welcome you to this very special edition of the Hay House Biology Belief online course. In today's lesson, it's really about what's going on in the world around you. As you can see from the news and the headlines of the world, things are in a big state of upheaval. And yet there's something very interesting because there's a science and a biology underneath all of this that explains what is happening in the world and how we can thrive through all these changes. So the first thing we have to understand is this, that knowledge is power. And this is the point that I really want to emphasize in today's program for a very important reason, is that the knowledge that we grew up with, the knowledge about how genes control our lives and the fate of our biology and diseases, has now been transformed by all new sciences coming in. Specifically, the science of epigenetics, which we will go very deeply into, reveals your power in controlling your own genetics and your behavior. So as we move forward, what I really need you to see is that the crises that we face in this world, it's just really something telling us that we need to change. We can no longer keep living in the same way. So every day when you look at the newspaper and you see the headlines, terrorism, or a crisis in economy, or a crisis in fuel, or a crisis in climate, I want you to recognize something very important. While we see each of these as individual crises, the real story is that all these crises come together in the sense of one overriding global crisis. And that crisis is we are no longer sustainable as a human population on this planet. We have undermined the ecosystems to such a degree that we're leading to a mass extinction because of the number of species that are disappearing every day. Today we're losing species at 1,000 times greater rate than it has been throughout history. And it reveals that we are facing some very large ecological problems that will alter human life on this planet. And it's interesting because we would like to say that, oh, this is just a natural consequence of planetary being and the solar system and all that. But no, we now know that human behavior is fundamentally undermining the ecosystem. In fact, the scientists now refer to this epoch, this period of time that we're in, as the Anthropocene. And that means, Anthropocene means that human action is altering the evolution of our planet. And that's because we've been undermining the entire ecosystem, the web of life. The way we've been raping the planet and taking its resources, the way we've been altering the habitats of organisms on this planet, we have greatly interfered with the normal expression of life. And therefore, we have to recognize it's our behavior that must change. And when we look at our behavior, for example, we can see some of the great catastrophes that have recently occurred. For example, there was the great oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico not that long ago. And while people think that it's all cleared up, they actually haven't understood that the oil is still at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico and is wiping out life every day. In fact, the largest area of the Gulf of Mexico around Louisiana is called a dead zone because nothing can grow there anymore. Well, that's one of the ways we're altering life on this planet. Another one, as you might be familiar with, is the Fukushima nuclear plant accident that happened after the tsunami. Now, again, why is this relevant? Because human behavior did not plan on the consequences of destruction of a nuclear plant and the release of radioactivity that is now flooding through the Pacific Ocean and moving toward North America and South America. Again, this is changing the life in the ocean. It's killing species very quickly and altering others as much. Something else that we're facing right now is major climate change. And in this illustration, which is a picture of a glacier in Alaska in 1941, you can see how very high packed the ice was at that time period. But then I say, well, what does it look like today? So here's a picture from the very same spot now 40, 60 years later, and look what we see. And all of a sudden we see that the glacier has disappeared. And why is this relevant? Because where did the water go? And the answer is it's going into the sea. And glaciers all around the planet are going into the sea, and the water level is rising, and it's threatening human civilization. So basically, we're coming down to a very important insight, and that is this. As the headlines reveal, we're facing the sixth mass extinction of life on this planet. 5 times in the history of Earth, life was thriving, and then it just got wiped out. And when we look at the nature of what was causing the destruction of life, In history, the 5 previous mass extinctions have been attributed to things like comets or asteroids hitting the Earth and upending the entire environment and, of course, wiping out life. Also, there were periods of massive geological activity on the planet, earthquakes and volcanoes all over the surface of the planet, which again wiped out life. But today, we're finding that we're losing species of organisms on this planet faster than in the previous 5 mass extinctions. But there's something more grave about the cause of this 6th mass extinction, and that is simply this. Science has recognized that the extinction we're facing now is due to human behavior. And so really it is incumbent upon us to start recognizing that we are involved with the fate and future of this planet. Interestingly, NASA scientists have recently come up with a massive study that revealed that within several decades, which to me means 10 to 20 years, that civilization is going to face an irreversible collapse. So all of a sudden the science recognizes that human civilization is heading toward an end. And basically we can talk about this collapse of civilization, and most people are focusing on all the fears and the threats of such a collapse. But I want you to recognize something more important, and that is crisis ignites evolution. And why is this important? Because the crises that we're facing, the crises that we're facing today, can only be resolved by changing the way we live on this planet, which means we are being forced into creating another way of life, another way of humans to behave toward each other and toward this planet. And while we are facing this extinction phenomena and the loss of so-called civilization, we must recognize this as well, that in the history of Western civilization, yes, civilization has collapsed, but civilization has been rebuilt many times over and over again. So when we review Western civilization's history, we see this is not the first time a civilization has faced crises that has caused it to change its belief systems. So as we look back over time, for example, I can tell you the civilizations that have come and gone before today's current civilization. Civilization was referred to as animism. And what that meant was this. These were people, the indigenous people who lived on the planet. And how they treated the planet was really interesting because they treated the planet as both a spiritual and a physical entity and learned to live in harmony with both. But that civilization ended when a new civilization called polytheism came in. And polytheism brought us the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Romans. And polytheism itself is a civilization. Yes, the Roman civilization collapsed. And what happened in its place is civilization didn't end, just a new civilization was created, and that was the civilization that was referred to as Judeo-Christian monotheism. This is when the church was running civilization. And yet, even that civilization crashed, and that was around 1860 when Charles Darwin entered the scene. That was when the church's control of civilization gave way to science controlling civilization. You say, well, what is all these controls related to? Why does one end and why does another one begin? Well, the answer is very basically this, that the civilizations that we're talking about are all based on how they dealt with the 2 realms of the universe. The 2 realms of the universe? Yes, there's the physical material realm in which you're living right now, but there's also an invisible realm, an energy realm, a spiritual realm that is also present. And this has been known by the ancients. So from the beginning of time of human civilization, the population had to deal with the nature of 2 realms of life, the invisible spiritual realm and the material realm. The story I'm going to unfold for you really reveals how the belief in spirituality, or the belief in what we call materiality, changes over time. And when these beliefs change, so does civilization change along with it. So let's look at civilization as a living system, because it is. It's made out of people, and living systems all have a characteristic. Living systems have a birth, a maturation, a maturity, and then a decline. And we can talk about it as the life cycle. So when we talk about a life cycle of a civilization, what we can see is that over time, a civilization originates, it develops, matures, and then goes into decline. Interestingly, that's the same image that can be used talking about a human. We are born, mature, and then ultimately decline. So I say, okay, let's look at the growth and death of a civilization. The first part of a civilization's life is the development part. The development part is really important because in the development of a civilization, the people are trying out new beliefs, new ideas, new ways of life, trying to live in harmony. And the significance about that is we are creating a new vision as a civilization is getting off the ground. As the beliefs start to become concrete and actually formalized, then the civilization is taking on its more mature shape. As we start to recognize, when we get into the very mature shape of that civilization, it's a rigid belief system that has been acquired over that developmental period. So we buy into beliefs and we say, these are the beliefs of the world, and this is how the universe works, and this is how people work, etc., etc. So actually what we enter into is a period of rigidity. Rigidity in not changing our beliefs very easily, buying into our beliefs as absolute truths and trying to live to those truths. There's only one problem about being rigid in the universe, and that is this: nothing in the universe ever stays the same. The universe is dynamic and ever-changing and moving. So a civilization that gets into a rigid belief system actually leads to what are called challenges. And the challenges are the things that cause a population to see that their belief system is really not supporting them. That's when the civilization starts to collapse, because the crises that result from rigid beliefs not adapting to an ever-changing universe cause us to find ourselves in a state of disrepair, so to speak, that the civilization is not working. We go into that decline. Well, you say, okay, the civilization was born and matured, it got rigid, faced challenges, and then went into decline, so then it should be all over with. I go, no. Because as the civilization is in decline, what's happening is a new civilization is being created. And this new civilization is based on what are called cultural creatives. People who are looking for answers outside of the box, looking for new ideas, new insights into living in this world to help us survive, and more than just survive, actually to thrive into the world. And in fact, if you're watching this video, I'd like to thank you and acknowledge you because you represent a cultural creative. You are seeking answers outside of the box to look for resolutions to the crises that we face today. And that's why I'm excited to be here, because I'm going to hopefully provide you with some of those answers to help us move on. So, the civilization that we're in is coming to an end, but don't worry, because we're also creating the new civilization at this moment, and you are the participants in that project. As cultural creatives, I really want to thank you because you are the people that are going to lead us from today's crisis into the world that we can thrive in tomorrow. To understand the nature of why civilization is changing and what creates a civilization, the beliefs behind it, we have to go back and recognize that there are two realms to the universe, the invisible realm and the physical realm. And what we've seen over evolution is a change in which realm is emphasized by the people of a civilization. In other words, some civilizations are more into the spiritual aspect of life, and other civilizations are more into the material realm of life. So if actually I wanted to address a civilization and ask them a question, how much of the population believes that spirituality is really the primary source of their life experience, or ask them how much of the population believes that the material realm really represents their life experiences, we'll see that over time the proportion of populations change. So in this illustration of a gradient, at the bottom of the gradient where it's white, let's just say this is asking a population if you believe in spirituality. And if they don't believe in spirituality, then they'll be down at the bottom of the gradient, meaning they don't believe in it. But as you get more and more people believing in spirituality, and a greater proportion of the population believes in it, then we're moving deeper up into the yellow of that gradient. So it's a range. At the bottom, people really don't think spirituality is that important. And at the top, they believe that spirituality is everything. While I show a gradient of spirituality, I can also show a gradient of material belief systems. And this is a reverse gradient because it's white at the top and it goes to dark blue at the bottom. And what I mean by this gradient is that if I ask an individual, do you believe the material realm is more important than the spiritual realm? Well, then what we're going to see is this. If they don't believe the material realm is important, then we're going to see that they're at the top of the gradient in the white part. But as more and more of the population starts to recognize the importance of the material realm, then we start to see that the population gets greater and greater into the matter zone, and they're now at the bottom of the gradient. So I have two gradients in reverse, spirituality moving upwards and materiality moving downwards. Well, it's kind of hard to look at both gradients at the same time, so the best thing we can do right now is bring the two gradients together and look at it as just one chart. So we have a midline. Above the midline, we go towards spirituality, where a population believes that spirituality is predominant in their life. Below the midline is where a population believes that the material plane is more important in their life. So I say, okay, good. Now I say, but how do I know what the population believes? Well, here's an interesting understanding, is that there have been questions about human civilizations that have been asked for over 10,000 years. These questions are referred to as the perennial questions. The three main questions are, how did I get here? Why am I here? And lastly, how do I make the best of it now that I'm here? Well, what's significant is when somebody offers answers to these questions and the population buys their answers, these answers shape the character of that civilization. And also, whoever we buy the answers from for those three questions, we also seek them out for questions about anything about life because they represent civilization's truth providers. So, the character of a civilization, perennial questions, how did we get here? Why are we here? And lastly, how do we make the best of it? These answers constitute what is called the basal paradigm. And what I mean by that, paradigm is an idea, a blueprint. Basal means fundamental. So the basal paradigm are the fundamental beliefs that shape a civilization. So I say, okay, let's go back 10,000 years ago and ask the population how they see spirit and matter as relevant to their lives. And when we go back 10,000 years ago, what do we find? We find that animists were here, the indigenous people, the Indians of North and South America, the Aborigines in Australia, the Druids in Europe, wherever there were indigenous people. What was unique about their lives is that the indigenous people saw that life was equally balanced between a spiritual life and a material life. In other words, in, let's say, Native Americans or First Nation people, they saw everything as both spiritual and material. Every blade of grass was spiritual. Every tree was spiritual. Every animal was spiritual. The significance of this is, for example, if they were going to go on a hunt for a deer, before they would go after the physical deer, they would make an offering and thank the deer's spirit so that they would have to balance the spiritual realm with the material realm. And this was just a wonderful part of life because at this way of life, there was great harmony in the world. And in fact, these people were the ones that saw Earth as a garden, and they were there as gardeners tending to that garden. So I say, okay, Native American people, for example, how did their basal paradigm answers come out? Well, if you go back to that day, you get a very simple understanding. You ask the natives, where did you come from? And they say, we came from Father Sky and Mother Earth. Now, that sounds very mythological, golden book of knowledge kind of stuff, but here's the truth. That is an actual scientific reality. Yes, the physical body of the human came from the physical chemistry of the earth. So the mother gave us our physical body. But life was introduced from the photons of light that came from the sun. So Father Sky offered us the energy that enlightened our physical matter. So it created what is called organic chemistry. The fusion of the sky's sunlight with the earth's matter created the chemistry that gives rise to life. So yes, the native belief system, Father Sky and Mother Earth, is accurate scientifically. And then you say, well, why are you here? And the answer they came up with is they were here to tend the garden. So they saw themselves as organisms within the garden, living in harmony with the garden and maintaining that garden. And then you would ask them, well, how do you make the best of it? Well, their answer was simply this, was to learn to live in harmony with nature. And this was really the belief system that cultivated how they lived on the planet, how they formed community, how they related to each other, and specifically how they related to the planet itself. So this was a very beautiful time in our history. It was a very peaceful time. And recognize this, in this world, in that belief system, everything that was matter was also spiritual. As I said, from a blade of grass to a human, everything had both matter and spirit. But things changed over time. And what happened over time was the new beliefs came in, new beliefs that led to polytheism. And I said, well, what does that really represent? And the answer is simply this. In animism, every individual object had its own spiritual connection. But polytheism changed the story a bit. Rather than every blade of grass having spirit in it, they created a god of nature, a god of plants, a god of water, a god of trees. They had a god for all of these different objects in our world. So they took the spirituality out of the individual and put that spirituality into figurehead gods. And then they started to worship the gods, which meant they started paying less attention to the physical world and putting more emphasis on the gods in the world, the spirit of the world. So we can talk about Mount Olympus, for example, where all these gods aggregate and hang out. But interestingly enough, they were still connected to the earth. The gods were here on the earth. So I said, well, okay, there was a removal of spirituality from individuals and a coalescence of spirituality into individual gods. And I go, yes, this is really very critical. And I say, well, what's the consequence of that? And I say, when we look at the chart of spirituality and materiality, what we start to notice is this. The population is moving from the midline, balance, where animism was, into the range of emphasizing spirituality over the material plane. So I say, okay, let's go back and now say, what were the basal paradigm beliefs, the cultural beliefs that shaped this civilization? Well, number one, for example, the Greeks said, how did we get here? They say we got here through chaos. And you go, well, you got here through chaos. What does that mean? You say, well, what they meant was that there was just this big jumble of stuff, and then all of a sudden it's shaped up into the universe as we saw. And you go, well, that's interesting, but it's not the same story as the First Nations people. I go, yeah, but it's still scientific. You say, well, how can both of them be scientific? Because I can say the Greeks had a vision of the earth before the earth. And what they saw was what we would call today the Big Bang. They saw that out of the invisible energy, chaos of the energy precipitated the physical plane. So their idea that we came from chaos is actually justified in today's cosmology about the nature of the Big Bang and the precipitation of matter from energy. So I say, okay, the source is chaos. And then you ask them, well, why are you here? Well, the answer is very hard to find for a very simple reason. If we got here from chaos, where was the plan? So all of a sudden you say, well, there was no specific reason that they could see for us to be here. That third question was specifically this: how do we make the best of it? And the answer they had, which is kind of humorous, is don't anger the gods. And you go, well, that's interesting, and I mean, it makes sense in a degree, but what do you mean don't anger the gods? And here's what the catch was. In those cultures, the gods could take on any form, any shape. They could become anything. They could become your pet dog. They could become your neighbor. And the whole idea about it is what? Well, since you never knew who or what a god was, then you were really coerced, more or less, to live in high honor on this planet and respect everything, because the last thing you want to do is disrespect a god. So you had to recognize that everything or everyone could be a god, and that really controlled the behavior of people so that they would live in harmony and happiness with each other. The polytheistic civilization was unique because they separated spirituality from the individual and coalesced them in the gods that we could seek answers from about how to live on this planet. Over time, even the polytheistic cultures found their own crises that led to their own demise. And it's interesting because as polytheism was fading away, a new belief system was coming in and creating a new civilization. The new civilization is based on what we call Judeo-Christian monotheism. What's interesting about this figure, it shows the representation of God as a human and instilling life into Adam with that famous picture where their two fingers are just about touching each other. And why is this relevant? Because the belief system now is that life is imparted through the direct intervention of God, that there's a divine intervention that gives us the spark of life, and that's what it illustrated. Well, there's another interesting story behind this Judeo-Christian belief system, that is this. Remember, animists saw every object in the world as being spiritual. And then we went into polytheism, and we saw that the objects lost their spirituality, but were coalesced into gods, which still lived on the planet. This new version of civilization, Judeo-Christian monotheism, was then another extension of that. And what happened here is, rather than a series of gods, all the gods were put into one unique supreme being. And that supreme being didn't even live on this planet. So what you have seen now over the civilizations changing is the loss of the material realm as being relevant, and more of our emphasis going into appeasing the invisible spiritual realm. So now then we look at the chart and we see very interestingly that as we progress into Judeo-Christian monotheism, we now move deeply into the spiritual realm, where almost all of the population believed that spirituality was everything. And in fact, that matter was not even considered near spirituality. Matter was to be damned. And the whole idea about this was a belief that your spiritual essence was the important part of you, and that it was here to live out what are called plays of morality, that you came to this physical world to see if you were worthy enough to go to that spiritual ending place, that so-called heaven out in the celestial gardens somewhere. And why this becomes relevant is because now we start emphasizing spirituality over everything. So I say, okay, well, let's first look at the nature of the perennial questions, how the answers changed in Judeo-Christian monotheism. How did we get here? Well, as we mentioned, divine intervention, a direct effect through God himself. Number two, why are we here? As mentioned, we're here to live out plays of morality. That is, to see if we can walk through this world, keep ourselves on a high enough plane so that when we leave this world, we can go freely into the gates of heaven. So our actions on this world were really governing whether we will be able to meet God in heaven at some future time. I say, well, then how do you make the best of it? The third question. And the answer was simply this: the laws of the Bible. So basically, we started to live by rules that were pronounced in the written texts of the Bibles. And we gave our power over to the church for a very simple reason, and the reason is simply this. Remember, whoever we get the answers from that we accept for the basal paradigm, we make the provider of those answers the supreme truth provider for our civilization. So now, once Judeo-Christian monotheism took over, if you had any questions at all about life, the first thing you do is you go see the man in the black coat, because he represented the voice of the church, and the voice of the church was claimed to represent the direct voice of God. So the church had what was called infallible knowledge, and this was the knowledge which ran the world at that time. There's something very important about absolutes, and especially when it comes to power. Because when you talk about absolute power, you're talking about absolute corruption. It's a corruption of power when individuals hold all the power in their hand. And so the relevance about that is that the church started to feed off of the people that it was serving. It took away their possessions, claiming that the material possessions will divert them from their trek going toward heaven, and that earthly things shouldn't be in their way. Matter was damned. And it was really interesting because the church really said, give us all your possessions and then we will save you. And this is unfortunately part of the absolute corruption that led to the crisis of this particular form of civilization. However, the civilization didn't collapse, but instead there was a change, a transformation, a reformation. And this was actually due to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who claimed that the church was really violating the rights of the individuals and taking too much power and actually usurping the health and activity of the people that they served. Martin Luther put his questions on the church door and said, challenge the church's belief. Well, this led to a change in the population, but it didn't lead to a change in what is called the basal paradigm. We still have the same belief about God and divine intervention and the laws of the Bible, but with a slightly different take, because the Protestants had another look at the nature of materiality, and that was simply this. Rather than being damned, the Protestants saw that having possessions might reflect God's gift to you, that if God loves you, God will give you things. And all of a sudden, then having possessions was no longer a damned part of life, but it was actually a recognition of your alignment and allegiance with the Holy Spirit. So the Protestants said, yes, possessions are not so bad. And as you can see from the chart, when the Reformation came, we moved from the high point where everything was spiritual and are moving back down toward the material plane. Well, this opened up a lot of opportunity to challenge the church in different ways. And the church felt this challenge and was really antagonistic to the Protestants for taking away the herd. So the church was really interested in rebuilding their image to the public. One of the most interesting and important aspects of why people end up going to church turned out to be the festivals and the holidays. So the church started to see, wow, we should really emphasize these special holidays and festivals to bring more people back into the church. Well, there was a problem with trying to understand how to program these festivals and holidays for this very simple reason. Some of the holidays were on a yearly cycle, a sidereal cycle, meaning every 365 days. So, for example, the birth of Jesus in the literature is on December 25th, and it's always on December 25th every year, so everybody knows when that festival or holiday is going to be celebrated. However, there were other holidays that were actually tied to the lunar cycle. So, for example, Easter is tied to a lunar cycle. It's not on the same day every year. It changes, and here's the reason why. The lunar cycle of 28 days does not evenly fit into a 365-day cycle. So the two cycles are not in harmony. And this is where the church ran into a problem. How could they schedule these special holidays that were on a lunar cycle and put it into the yearly calendar cycle? Well, they were at a loss. So what did they need to do? They needed to find somebody who could help them guide the understanding of the calendar to a much higher degree. And what they found was a priest who was an astronomer by the name of Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was even more than an astronomer. He was a medical doctor as well. I say, so what did they ask of Copernicus? They said, look, can you look at the stars in the sky and tell us how we can program the holidays and the festivals so that all of the churches are celebrating at exactly the same time? Well, Copernicus takes this vision back to his place and looks at the world, looks at the stars, and realizes something very important. That in the Bible, the earth is the center of God's firmament, that the moon, the planets, the stars all revolve around the earth. The earth is the center of the universe. Well, the problem is when Copernicus was trying to map the stars and time, he realized that it just didn't fit. It just didn't work this way. But he went back to an older period. He went back to the polytheists. He went back to Egypt. And he found that there was an understanding there that the earth was not the center of the universe, that we were just a planet moving around the sun and among all the other stars, which are suns in the universe as well. And when he went back to Ptolemy's original work on the solar system and started to look at the Earth not at the center of the universe, but as a revolving planet around our own star, the sun, he was then able to accurately predict all of the dates for not just the yearly cycle, of course, which was simple, but for all the festivals that were on a lunar cycle. And he was so excited, he brought it back to the church elders and said, look, I've solved the problem. Here are the dates, and you can calculate all of these holidays and festivals from this data. And they asked him, well, how did you do it? And he said, I only had to do one thing. And they said, what was that? He said, well, I had to take the earth out of the center of the universe. And they all went, oh my God, you can't change the truths of the Bible. This is the fundamental word of God. But they were so enamored with the idea that they could get all the dates, they made an agreement with Copernicus. And the simple agreement was this: listen, we're going to use your calendar, but we're not going to tell people how we got it. And you cannot tell people how you got it. Because you know what happens to heretics, people who doubt the Word of God and doubt the Bible, is that they face what is called the Inquisition. They get tortured and punished for this belief. Well, armed with that knowledge, Copernicus, being the smart guy, decided, okay, I'm not going to tell the people about how we got there, but he already knew. He already knew that he broke the infallible nature of the church because he found a truth that was outside of the church's belief and differed with that church belief. And yet he couldn't tell anybody. And he lived with that most of his life. And then on his deathbed, he wrote a book on the nature of the revolutions of the planetary bodies, and he released his story. And it was kind of a last say to the church for this reason. He was saying, listen, I'm going to die, but I'm going to leave you with this problem, because here's the science of the new understanding of the universe. And then he died, and he left that. And all of a sudden the church couldn't actually get rid of Copernicus by putting him through an inquisition and taking away his character. They actually had to deal with the science in the book, and this changed the world, because science, the modern science we deal with, is dated from 1543, the date of Copernicus's death. The death of Copernicus marked a radical change on planet Earth because it opened the gateway for new knowledge, science, to come in and guide civilization into the future. Once the infallible nature of the church was broken by Copernicus's work, it opened up a new field of study, a field of science that was questioning the beliefs that were brought forward by the church and history before it. One of the big leaders of change was René Descartes. When Descartes came in, and everyone is familiar with Descartes' thinking about I am, and therefore there's two parts of me, a mind and a body, everyone's familiar with that. But they also didn't recognize that Descartes was involved with creating scientific methodology, a way of studying nature and the universe to identify a truth. What was really relevant about this is once the methodology to establish a truth was created, then Descartes offered the world a simple thing. He said, doubt everything. Meaning the entire history of beliefs that have been brought forward up to this time were not predicated on science or any method to really test the truth of these statements. So this said, open up the world and let's start looking at it through the eyes of a scientific assessment. And the first thing he saw when he was looking at the universe, he saw what looked like a clock. Now you have to recognize that clocks were brand new in Descartes' time, a mechanical device to tell time. And when he looked up at the stars in the sky, he realized, well, they're like a clock too, because you can tell time by them. That's the way people have always told time. So rather than looking at the stars as something in God's heaven where they were manipulated by spirits and invisible forces, Descartes' view was, if you study the universe, you might find that it's actually a physical mechanism that resembles the nature of a physical clock. So this was really the important insight that Descartes offered us, to go look at the world in a different way. Well, the idea of Descartes was a seed in the mind of Isaac Newton about 100 years later. And Isaac Newton, also looking at the solar system and the stars, considered Descartes' view that maybe it's a machine and a mechanism, and decided to study the movements of the universe to see if he can predict the actual movements of the stars and planets in our celestial heaven. Well, the first thing that Newton had to do to go on this trek was to create even a new science called calculus. So he was a brilliant mathematician before he became a physicist. Creating calculus to study the moving objects in space was the precursor to understanding the movements of the universe. Now, what's interesting about Newton's work is that he did not invoke God, spirits, invisible forces as controlling the universe as has previous generations. Newton started to measure the physical characteristics, the size of a planet, the mass of a planet, the acceleration of a planet, the vector in which it was moving. He put all these details into his calculus equation, and when he solved it, he was able to accurately predict the movements of the universe. And I go, well, here's what's so important about it. In a world that has been predicated on spirituality, here he finds that you can understand the nature of the universe by just looking at the material realm. And so this was really the foundation of what we call physics. And I want you to understand the nature of physics. Physics is another word for mechanisms. That's why I can say Newtonian physics or Newtonian mechanics, quantum physics or quantum mechanics. And you go, okay, what does that mean? Mechanism. I say mechanisms are the process by which the world and the universe unfold, looking at the details of how A goes to B goes to C in an unfolding world. So the mechanics of life are built into physics. And that's why it's actually the fundamental science of all sciences, because everything is built on these mechanics. Well, it's very interesting because in Newtonian view, of course, the universe is a machine, as he showed through his equations that you can predict these movements by just looking at the mechanical parts. But there's another aspect that we must emphasize right now about Newtonian physics, and that is it's based on materialism. Remember, we talked about two realms, a spiritual realm and a physical material realm. Well, Newtonian science took us away from a spiritual realm and said that you can understand the universe, and of course that means understanding the humans as well because we're part of that universe, not by looking at anything spiritual, but by just focusing on matter, materialism. So basically, science was introducing a new belief system. But it was really important for people to understand this, and the fact is this, is that science was not taking over the basal paradigm. It could not take it over. The church is still running civilization, and that science really had to walk around the church and not step on its toes because the church was still all powerful. But the interesting aspect of science is this. In the new Newtonian version of science, Francis Bacon talked about nature in the feminine, she, and said she had to be controlled and constrained, and she actually had to be broken down. So there was a misogynistic point of view from science in the beginning, looking at nature as female and recognizing it had to be controlled. And that was the mission of science, to control nature at that time. So we leave science because it hasn't come into the basal paradigm yet. It's working in the background at this time. But we must recognize an insight from Newtonian science, that yes, the universe is mechanical and physical, but everything in the universe is mechanical and physical, which then implies that humans, the human body, for example, is a machine, and that it could be understood as a mechanical device, and taking it apart as a machine, we would understand how the human body worked. We eliminate the nature of the invisible forces, spirit and God, in trying to understand the nature of life on this planet. But there's an interesting part then, and it relates back to René Descartes, because René Descartes told us there was a mind and a body. And yes, this is absolutely true. But now here comes the story. In a world of Newtonian physics, the body is studied by science because it's physical. But that means we must separate the mind, because the mind is not tangible, it's not mechanical, it's not physical, it's an energy, it's invisible. And since Newtonian physics says it is not required to understand the invisible forces to understand life, then science separated the mind from the body. And this was very important because this separation actually led science to follow its endeavors with the church still in control. How did that work out? The answer is this. Newton's science said, we study the body as a mechanical, material machine. We leave the mind, the invisible stuff, for the church. So the body was under the science of physics, but the mind and the invisible forces of spirits and God were left in the realm of what is called metaphysics and separated from science. This allowed science to study the body and not step on the toes of the church, which is really involved in the spiritual invisible domain, and this allowed science to get off the ground. So this became an important part of how science was allowed to develop, even though the church was the supreme controller of civilization at that time. After Newton died, the world was influenced by the writings of several new philosophers that came on the scene, including John Locke in London and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Paris. These were primary authors of what we call the Age of Enlightenment. In their work in the Age of Enlightenment, the story is that there's a good way to live on this planet, a happy, harmonious way to be healthy and live and be free of constraint and make the best of the world that you possibly can. Well, this story of a utopian world that was penned by the enlightened philosophers really touched the people in Europe for a big reason. Because you have to remember, in Europe, all the countries that were there were really based on a two-tier society. There was an upper class and a lower class. If you were in the upper class and you were born in the upper class, you will be upper class for the rest of your life, no matter what you do. If you were born into the lower class, you will always be lower class and never rise above that. And all of a sudden, your fate was determined by where you were born. Well, obviously, the mass population in Europe was representing the lower class population. And they were really supporting the wealthy upper class people above them. And there was a lot of stress and strain on these people to carry out this work. So when the Age of Enlightenment philosophy reached them, they started to dream, I would love this utopian world. I would love to live in that. Well, now we take one step back and say, where did the idea, for example, from Rousseau's book of a utopia, where did he get his ideas of a world that lived in harmony like that? And the answer is very interesting. Rousseau studied the American Indians. He studied their culture, and he called them the noble savage, that these people who lived on this land, not being in Western civilization part of that world, but being the savages of this new world, they lived on this land, but guess what? They could make anything out of the lives that they wanted. They were not limited by birth or any other restrictions. A human could do what a human wanted to. As much effort as they wanted to put in, they can create whatever they wanted for themselves. Well, this story for the repressed people in Europe was very enlightening, of course. And they all got the ideas that maybe we should leave Europe and go to the land where the Indians are. And this is what essentially brought the white people from Europe into North America. They came to live as the Indians. They left behind their European culture. They moved in with the Indians. The Indians took them in as brothers and made them part of their community. In the end, these Europeans actually began to look like Indians. They dressed in buckskins. They bathed regularly, which was not a character of European life at all. And they lived this new life, that freedom life, living on their land and being the masters of their own life. Well, this brought an onslaught of people from Europe into the new country of North America. And it was very interesting because there were a group of people who came in and not only lived like the Indians, but also bought into their philosophy, the philosophy that God and nature are one and the same, and that by understanding nature, you would get more insight from God. And so those that studied this new belief were called deists. And you go, well, deists, what's that? Well, it's not a religion. It's a philosophy of life. It's a philosophy of how to stand on your own feet and make the utopian world that you can imagine. So I say, well, who are the deists? Do we know any of them? And I go, well, here are some interesting names. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Paine, and the list goes on. You go, Yes, the founding fathers of this country were deists. They came to live the First Nation, Native American way of life. And in that way of life, guess what they found? There was already a United States here for 600 years before the white people got here. It was called the Iroquois Nation. It was 6 tribes that were originally battling and killing each other for years until a peacemaker came together about 600 years before the white people got here and said, listen, we're wasting our lives, we're wasting our resources on fighting. Why don't we just join together, become one nation, and live in harmony? And for 600 years, the United States was populated by millions of natives living in harmony, treating the planet as the garden. And this was the beautiful part that drew the white people over. But they had a government. And when the founding fathers were deciding to separate themselves from England, they started to build the concept of a government. And where did they get their fundamental ideas? They got them from the Native Americans. And it was very interesting because while the Native Americans had a much richer nature of government, the Europeans couldn't follow exactly the Indian track for this simple reason. Number one, many of the tribes, only women could vote for the chief. And this was an anathema to the Europeans, who really never counted women as relevant to anything when they came over, that the idea of giving women the vote in a government just couldn't cut it with the Europeans, so they left that out. Number two, the natives had a 2-parliament system. They had the equivalent of a House of Representatives and the equivalent of a Senate. The House of Representatives, like today, was filled with Indians coming from all the different tribes and meeting together in one house. But the Senate was totally different. In Indian culture, the Senate was called the Council of Grandmothers. And in that council were only grandmothers whose wisdom they sought for all issues about peace and war. They would go to the grandmothers and get their information. Of course, the Europeans couldn't handle that, so we put the old boys in our version of the Senate as well. We created a new government, and the Declaration of Independence was really what was the most important breakthrough of merging Native American philosophy and European philosophy into one piece. And what's so important about this Declaration of Independence is the first sentence. The first sentence in the Declaration of Independence is a very powerful statement and reads as follows. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. What's really powerful about this statement is the term, the laws of nature and of nature's God. And I say, why is that important? I say, because the laws of nature referred to Mother Earth, and nature's God refers to Father Sky. In fact, the deists who wrote the Declaration of Independence really took the animistic nature of God and spirit and matter all being as one and wrote that into the Declaration of Independence. And this is really a very important fact to acknowledge, because so many fundamentalists today are claiming that the Declaration of Independence was a Christian document and that we created a Christian nation. But if you actually read that first sentence, it says, no, it was a deist document. What was interesting about the deist perspective is that it took us back to the original beliefs of the indigenous people. That took us to the midline between matter and spirit, because in a deist perception, as in the native perception, everything that was made out of matter was also spiritual. So while it was very interesting, we now see that civilization is moving from its high in the spiritual range and then going back toward matter through the Reformation. Now civilization finds itself on the crosshair of the midline because of the deist belief. Yet the deist belief did not change the nature of the basal paradigm, so the church is still running civilization at this time. So what happened was that this nation was built on the philosophy of deism and not on the laws of religion. In the last section, we learned that even with deist beliefs built into the Declaration of Independence, the church was still running the world. And that was until 1859, when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. And I say, well, why was this so interesting? And the answer is simply this. Remember, science was still building itself up under the church's dominance, but creating miracles nonetheless. Interestingly, this new science offered an opportunity to enter into the basal paradigm because Darwin's story gave us an answer to the first question, which science never had. The first question in the basal paradigm is, how did we get here? And Newton's science, with all the miracles it produced, was not able to answer that question. And until science could come up with an answer to how we got here, it was not in competition for the truth provider of this world. But with Darwin's work, all of a sudden the public could see very quickly belief in evolution really overwhelmed the belief in the magic of a 7-day unfolding of Genesis. And the reason why the people gravitated to Darwin's belief so quickly was simply this. Back in the days of no TV, no Game Boys, no toys, what did people do for recreation? Well, one of the biggest sources of recreation was breeding animals and plants. And what they saw in those breeding experiments is exactly what Darwin emphasized as the origin of species. Darwin's origin of species is simply this, is that an organism appears and it's a variant of its parents. And that variation, being weird, could go on, and if bred with other variants, could lead to variations so great that they depart from the original species. Well, this is the foundation of evolution. We start with a species, and then through reproduction and variation, you give rise to variants that ultimately lead to new species. This was built into the theory. I say relevance was simple, is that the public was already aware of the fact that by breeding plants and animals, you get the occasional weirdo in the litter, the runt of the litter, so to speak. And so it didn't take them very long to say, yes, if you take these runts and you move them in their own line and reproduce them, they could lead to something totally different. So the interesting aspect, their familiarity, the people's familiarity with the nature of breeding plants and animals at that time, allowed them to rapidly accept the story offered by Charles Darwin. So while his book was released in 1859, by 1869, the world has bought into his belief system about life and left the church's beliefs behind. We move from the original paradigm where monotheism claimed divine intervention into a new paradigm, a new belief that says that we got here through random mutations. And you go, wow, okay, first question answered by science. We got here through variations of mutations or alterations in heredity that are perpetuated through reproduction. People bought into it and said, fine. And yet, we then have a problem because the second question that comes in the basal paradigm is, why are we here? And then we hark back to the nature that the key step in Darwinian theory, the first step, is the creation of a variation in heredity. Today we refer to those variations as mutations, and they were referred to as random mutations, accidental mutations. You say, well, what's the relevance? I say, how can you ascribe purpose to evolution when evolution was driven by accidents of genetics? And all of a sudden you say, well, oh my God, we have no purpose. According to that belief, we just got here by the accidental shaking of genetic dice, so to speak. And all of a sudden it says, wow, there's no answer for our purpose. We have no purpose. But they did have an answer for the third question, how do you make the best of it? And the answer was to recognize that to be the survival of the fittest in the struggle for existence, that it was not a civilization built on the principles of morality of religion. It was built on a competition. And basically it said that in our world today, that there's a rat race, a dog-eat-dog world. Why? Because the Darwinian theory incorporates the belief that there's not enough for all of us. And as a result of not being enough for all of us, there's a struggle for what's available. This idea of not enough for all of us and the struggle for survival is actually predicated on a belief that was provided by an earlier science philosopher by the name of Thomas Malthus. Rather than being a deist or an enlightened person, Malthus created a philosophy called pessimism. And what's interesting about pessimism is simply this. It simply states that as plants grow, they don't grow as fast as animals reproduce. So in other words, if you're a farmer and you're cultivating your land and you plant, let's say, wheat, and at the end of the season you get a bushel of wheat from your land, you say, great. But next year you come back and you work extra hard. You put more fertilizer in, you tend it a little bit better, and the second year you end up getting 2 bushels of wheat. And I go, okay, that's really good. And the third year, you improve it a little bit more, and then you ultimately get 3 bushels of wheat. When you look at this chart of the growth of plants, what you recognize is this. There is what is called an arithmetic progression in the creation of more food, meaning first 1 bushel, then 2 bushels, the third year 3 bushels, the fourth year 4 bushels. So you are slowly increasing the production of food. And this is called arithmetic progression. In contrast, though, animals, when they breed, tend to double the population. So the first year you start with 2 animals, and the second year you end up having 4 animals, and the third year you end up having 8 animals, and it keeps doubling. And I say, well, this is called geometric progression. And as you can see on the chart, the food does not keep up with the production of animals. Animals breed too fast, faster than we can increase the quantity of food. Well, there's only one conclusion from this, and this is what Malthus came to. He said, there will be an inevitable struggle for food because there are going to be more animals than food, and only the strongest of those animals are going to get the food. The weakest ones are not going to get the food, and the weakest ones will die out. And this is where survival of the fittest came into our philosophy as a way of life. It was based on the belief that populations of animals, which include humans, are going to exceed the available nature of food to feed those humans. And as a result, there's going to be a struggle. And this is the whole foundation of the Darwinian theory that says life is not easy. Life is a competition. Life is a competition for survival. And this is what we bought into. And now we have to recognize, how are we going to deal with this extra population? Well, it was very interesting because they already had ideas. Thomas Malthus came up with the first idea of how to do with overpopulation. He said, build homes for the poor people in swampy areas. He created a new word called slum. He said, if we build slums, this kind of environment promotes disease. And as a result of disease and slums, the poor people, which are reproducing fast, will begin to die out, and therefore we can lower the population. A second natural way of reducing the population is famine. Because without food, of course, then the population is going to die out. So now we challenge their health. We challenge their ability to eat, which will also reduce the population. And then very interestingly, war became recognized as a biological necessity. It said, in order to thin out the population, wars every now and then are a good thing because they'll eliminate those extra people. So it became war as a biological necessity in bringing down that ever-growing population that would increase the number of people competing for that small volume of food. Significance here is that we added one more change. And over time, science added something called birth control, with the idea that if we give these people that are reproducing too fast means of birth control, we will stem population growth and not face that ultimate conflict of the competition for food. If you think the action of eliminating this excess population is inhumane, you really must go back and recognize we're talking about a period called Victorian England. And in Victorian England, there was an upper class and a lower class. And the upper class was completely separate and distinct from the lower class. They couldn't even really communicate on a social level at all. I say, well, what's the significance of the class in the theory of evolution? And I say, perhaps you're familiar with the phrase survival of the fittest in the struggle for evolution. The significant survival of the fittest was a very specific term picked out for this evolutionary theory. Let's go back and look at this. And in this image, what you'll start to see is that I have a number of individuals, and there's a definition for the word fit. Fit means capable of surviving. And so if I show this group of individuals and I have 10 of them that are fit and 2 of them that are not fit, then I would say that nature would mean that the 2 that were not fit would die off and be eliminated through a process called natural selection. But that leaves the 10 remaining individuals. However, in Victorian England, they're not all fit. We can separate them. We can call some just fit, some better off, more fit or fitter, and the best ones are the fittest. So when I talk about survival of the fittest, I'm not talking about the survival of all people capable of surviving. I'm talking about the survival of the upper class as compared to the rest of the population. That population they were trying to get rid of through disease or through war or through famine. You get rid of fit and fitter elements, leaving the fittest. So the lower class is selected against. Well, if natural selection eliminates the biologically weak ones because nature will select against them, then what kind of selection is it when you eliminate people who are actually capable of surviving? By definition, that is unnatural selection. So there is a tendency for the upper class to eliminate the lower class from breeding too much and threatening civilization as a whole, and they do it through unnatural selection. In that case, this means war. In the last section, we learned that the theory of evolution proposed by Darwin was based on changes in heredity. But it's very important to note that Charles Darwin and the scientists at that time had no concept of the nature of genes. In fact, they believed there were particles called gemmules, which were more like little paint droplets scattered around the body that were responsible for programming each part of the body. And that when 2 people would mate, the paint gemmule structures would come together and merge, and therefore the traits of the parents would be expressed in the offspring. However, while no knowledge about genes was understood by Darwin and his contemporaries, at the same time, in work in Middle Europe by Gregor Mendel on breeding plants and flowers, revealed a new insight into the nature of heredity. As I said, it was believed that hereditary factors would merge like paint and blend with each other. But this is what Mendel found out. When he would breed 2 plants, one with a white flower and one with a red flower, that the offspring, many of them were all pink. So there was a mixture of the white and the red. And this still conformed to the idea of gemmules. However, the world changed when Mendel started to mate the offspring, the 2 pink offspring together. So he took 2 offspring that were pink, mated them, and guess what? 25% of the flowers were white, 25% were red, and 50% were pink in the offspring. What was the relevance? The traits didn't blend together. They were still there as separate entities. The white gene was still expressing whiteness, even though they didn't know it was a gene at the time. The red was still being expressed as red. And so even though they were combined in the hybrid, they were able to separate out when the hybrids were mated. So all of a sudden it said that the units of heredity appeared to be discrete units that did not blend with each other but maintained their characteristics. And this was the first insight into the nature that there is a hereditary molecule in there that keeps its character in spite of being hybridized in mating situations. So in other words, the units of heredity were discrete particles of some kind. But what were they? Well, the answer wasn't clear yet, but in 1892, great insight was provided by a scientist by the name of August Weismann in Germany. Weissman was using microscopy, which was relatively newly developed in the last century, and using new techniques, he was able to actually study cells that were dividing. And what he noticed that when cells would divide, that in the center between the dividing cells, long filaments would start to aggregate, and that these filaments then were pulled apart, with half of the filaments going into one daughter cell and the other half of the filaments going into the other daughter cells. What he saw and what he identified were structures called chromosomes. And he linked these chromosomes to carrying hereditary traits. So all of a sudden, the scientists had a physical foundation of where to find heredity inside the cell, and that was to study the nature of the chromosomes. Well, the interesting issue is when they isolated the chromosomes and broke them down chemically, they found that the chromosomes consisted of 50% protein and 50% DNA. So now they were stuck with the question is it the DNA or the protein that is responsible for hereditary characteristics? Well, lots of work, but no results until 1944. In 1944, the resolution to the conundrum whether it's the protein or the DNA as the hereditary unit was revealed in studies by Avery, McCarty, and McLeod. Very famous study, and what they did was this. They had two kinds of bacteria, R and S. The R bacteria, when grown in culture, form little tiny dot-like cultures as a characteristic structure of these bacteria. The S bacteria are quite different. They would form big puddle colonies, big puddles of bacteria. And so there were morphologically two differences between the R and the S, the dot-like R cultures versus the puddle-like S cultures. So what the scientists did was isolate the chromosome from the S puddle-like bacteria, separate the DNA and the protein from the chromosome. And what they did is in separate cultures, they'd either add the DNA to the R bacteria, or they would add the protein to the R bacteria, the DNA and the protein coming from the S bacteria. So I have R bacteria cultured with S DNA and R bacteria cultured with S chromosomal proteins. And they wanted to see if the trait of the S bacterium would be carried through. And what did they find? They found that it was the DNA from the S bacterium, when added to R cultures, would transform the R cultures into S-like bacterial cultures, big puddles. The protein did not do that. So at the end of the day, they realized it was the DNA element of the chromosome that was carrying the genetic traits. Now, of course, is, well, how does it work? And it took 9 more years. 9 years later, work by Watson and Crick led to the identification of the DNA double helix. Well, with the DNA double helix identified and how it works to provide heredity, science revealed that human life is strictly derived from a physical biochemical foundation. And this took a civilization completely into the material range, because no longer did we have to invoke spirit or God or invisible forces in shaping human life. We now found there was a physical element, a DNA molecule, which provided for the genes which gave the characteristics to the organism. So in 1953, the double helix was revealed. A little sidebar here that's important. The work was actually first done by a woman, Rosalind Franklin, and her major advisor gave Rosalind Franklin's data to Watson and Crick, and they used her research to come up with the DNA double helix. So they usurped it, again, the old boy story in science holding true, that Rosalind Franklin was left out of the picture. So I say, okay, we got this DNA double helix. There are 2 strands of DNA. And it's interesting because the strands of DNA are made out of building blocks, 4 molecule building blocks that assemble together to create long strands. These building blocks are given a scientific name, nucleotides. You may have seen the letters of the DNA code, A, T, C, and G, as a part of the code, but the A stands for adenine, the T for thymine, the C for cytosine, and the G for guanine. These are building blocks. And what happens is these building blocks polymerize and assemble into a long chain. So I have a sequence of these bases, the A, T, C, G bases, going up the chain. What's very interesting is that an adenine will only bind to a thymine, an A will only bind to a T, and a cytosine will only bind to a guanine, a G. What that meant is this: wherever there's an A on one strand of the DNA, a complementary strand of DNA will have a T. So wherever there's an A and a T, they will come together and bind. And this is what causes two strands of DNA to form a helix. One stranding have a code with A, T, C's, and G's. The other strand has a complementary code. Wherever the first strand has an A, the complementary code has a T. Wherever the first strand has a G, guanine, the complementary strand has a C, cytosine, because they are in pairs like that. This allows one strand to complement and bind to the other strand, and that's how you get a double helix. The two strands twist together. Well, we come to a very interesting critical point in science's uncovering of heredity. We get down to the fact that says the body and characteristics were now recognized to be due to molecules called proteins, which we're going to go in depth and talk about later. So the body is made out of proteins. But it turns out the DNA molecule is a code or blueprint to make the proteins. So DNA is the precursor of the proteins, which is the giver of the physical characteristics of our body. The question they were left with is, where the heck does the DNA come from? It's a complex code. Where is the source of the DNA? Well, interestingly enough, this simple experiment was done, and what they did is they split a double helix DNA into a single chain, got rid of one chain. They took the single helix of DNA and put it in a beaker where there were the subunits of the DNA, the A, T, C, and G molecules. And they incubated a single strand of DNA in the solution of the building blocks. And when they pulled out that single strand of DNA from the beaker, guess what? Now it was a double strand of DNA. In other words, the single strand acted as a pattern or a template to create the complementary second strand. So when you split a DNA strand and then copy the one strand, you create a new second strand. So DNA copies itself. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, resolution. The answer is simple. DNA controls itself, and then DNA codes for the protein, which gives the individual organism its characteristics, so that the search for origin of life ended with the DNA, because it says the DNA can copy itself. We need not look any further for other molecules to be involved. DNA copies itself, and DNA is a template for the proteins. Well, Watson and Crick's work came out in 1953. With these additional studies on the nature of DNA duplicating itself, by 1958, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, came forth with a hypothesis. The scientific name for this hypothesis is called the central dogma. The central dogma is the equivalent of the Ten Commandments in biology. It is a foundational belief of which modern science is predicated. This is a hypothesis of how information flows in biological system. You probably learned it in school already. Information starts with the genes, which are DNA molecules. So the genes are converted, the DNA is converted into a temporary copy called RNA. So a gene version in RNA is like a Xerox copy of the gene. The RNA molecule is used inside the cell as a physical template to code for the proteins, which are the building block of the body. So the flow of information is from DNA to RNA and to protein. And this is a one-way flow according to the central dogma. And you go, okay, what the heck does that mean? Well, here's a very important conclusion. You, as an individual, represent protein. We are the protein. We came from the DNA blueprint. And according to the central dogma, information cannot go backwards. protein cannot inform RNA, and RNA cannot inform DNA in that central dogma story. Well, the problem is this. If we as proteins can't alter our DNA, then that means we have no control over the characteristics of our lives that are programmed by the genes. Well, that means then we essentially become victims, victims of our heredity, if you think about it, because we did not select the genes as far as we know. We can't change the genes if we don't like our trait. That's the central dogma. You can't change your genes. And all of a sudden you realize then your fate is not in your hands, but is actually controlled by the genes you receive from your parents. And this new idea of genes controlling life became the foundational belief in the definition for what is medical science. When we talk about the medical model, we talk about organisms are biochemical machines controlled by genes. And therefore, you see how the genetic code is translated into proteins. You are the translation of a genetic code, so your traits are predetermined in the DNA. And when you understand that, and you understand we had no choice in picking the DNA or changing it, then you see why we perceive ourselves as victims of heredity. And then once you see yourself as a victim, you're expressing powerlessness. I have no power over my genes. I am a victim. Unfortunately, when a person has a victim mentality, guess what? They start to look for a rescuer, someone on the outside to help them take their life into better hands. And that rescuer happens to be the pharmaceutical industry. And of course, what I'd like to just admit right now, they're not our friends, as we'll find out. So we buy the belief that we can't control our lives, we seek help from the outside. Well, this understanding of genes controlling life is a belief called genetic determinism. The population in general has been programmed with this belief. Genetic determinism means simply your genes determine the character of your life. And we have bought into that. But this is not really true. And science, real science people who are doing research, know that genetic determinism is not a true understanding of life at all. Unfortunately, the public is still programmed with that belief. So the public is still lost in the fact that genes control their lives. Well, back in 1990, a consortium of scientists got together with what they called the Final Biology Project. And the Final Biology Project is also known as the Human Genome Project. And the purpose of the Human Genome Project was simple. Since genes control our lives, then basically if we had a compendium, a list of all the genes that make up a human, then we could use those genes to engineer our biology and change our lives so that we can cure all forms of illness and problems and grow lost hair on people that need it and give people qualities and traits. And it's interesting because over the time, the genes meant more than just the physical attributes, because scientists started to see that maybe genes are controlling behavior and genes are controlling emotions as well. So genetic determinism is the belief that the character of your life is predetermined at the moment of conception when the genes are distributed from your mother and father into you. And this is where life goes on from there. So the Genome Project was, how can we get around this control issue? And the answer is, identify all the genes. Well, it's interesting because you might think the Human Genome Project was a humanitarian effort driven by people looking out for the benefit of civilization. Well, that's unfortunately not a true statement. The Human Genome Project was really pushed by the pharmaceutical industry. And you say, what do you mean? What for? And I say, listen, there are over 100,000 proteins in a human body. Each protein needs a gene to manufacture that protein. So even before the Human Genome Project gets off the ground, guess what? The scientists already had an idea of how many genes they expected to find. They expected to find over 100,000 and perhaps up to 150,000 genes in a human genome. So what did the drug company think? 150,000 genes in their mind is 150,000 new drugs, because each gene was going to be treated as a new drug. So they were very excited about this windfall of 150,000 new drugs. And they were even smarter than that. because what they did is they pushed the project as a humanitarian project. And this way, the public paid billions of dollars to identify the genes in the human genome. And guess what? Every gene that was found was patented by the pharmaceutical industry. Every gene in your body is actually owned by a company somewhere. And they use these genes and charge people for using these genes in research because they own the property rights to the genes. And that was the intention. And the beautiful part about it for the pharmaceutical industry is they ended up getting all these genes patented and never put a dollar into the pot to create the project. We did. Well, Mother Nature, she doesn't like a lot of that kind of fool around stuff. So what did she do? She blew them out of the water. And I said, well, what do you mean she blew them out of the water? Well, in 2003, the results of the Genome Project became available to us. They found that only 3% of all the DNA in our cells was actually genes that make proteins. 97% of the DNA doesn't code for anything they could see in the human body. They actually gave it a name called junk DNA, meaning, oh, this was extra DNA that cells being inefficient carried for millions and millions of years that have no function inside the cell. They were looking at cells as being as inefficient as humans are, which is a completely false assumption. Yes, humans are inefficient, but cells are totally efficient. So I say, okay, wait, only 3% of the DNA is the genes. Well, how many genes is that? Well, it turns out today, we now recognize that we have only about 19,000 genes. And you go, what do you mean 19,000 genes? The answer that we were looking for was over 100,000 genes. How can you create a human body with only 19,000 genes? And the answer is, our belief about how genes worked was so flawed, we were the ones that were expecting over 100,000 genes. The Human Genome Project revealed our complete understanding of genetic control was a misunderstanding. And we now had to rebuild biology from the bottom, saying, how can only 19,000 genes create something as profound as a human body? With only 19,000 genes to be found, scientists were caught with their genes down, about 100,000 to be in fact. And the significance was a big oops came forth. Oops, how can you make a human with so few genes? And why should it carry around all that junk DNA that is carried in the nucleus, that 97%? What's that going to lead to? Well, we have to understand something about our vision of evolution. We have to go back, and there's an old picture from way, way back in the late 1800s called the Tree of Life. And what it did was list and categorize all the organisms on this planet and gave a hierarchy from the simplest organisms to the top of the tree were the most advanced organisms. At the bottom of the tree are bacteria. At the top of this Tree of Life are humans in their picture. And they said, oh, well, this is the course of evolution. As you go from the base of the tree up to the tree, you're unfolding evolution. So the original idea was heredity was responsible for the evolution. And therefore, genes were directly connected to evolution. So that at the bottom, the primitive organisms would have very few genes. And as you go toward the top, more and more complexity would lead to more and more genes because the genes were providing the characteristics. So when you get to the level of human, that's why they anticipated there was going to be over 100,000 genes. But what did we find? Well, in this picture, I hold in my hand 3 organisms. One of them is a miniature worm that's hardly visible with a naked eye called Caenorhabditis elegans. This is an organism that geneticists use in research today because it's an extremely small organism with 1,271 cells. And it has lots of behaviors and characteristics. So geneticists study this very simple organism, trying to get the secrets of genetics with a very small number of cells. And it turns out the Caenorhabditis elegans has about 19,000 genes. And then you go higher up the tree, and there's supposed to be more genes, and we end up with the fruit fly, again, another major species studied by geneticists and understanding heredity. And you say, well, how many genes does this more advanced fruit fly have over the worm? And you can see how much more complex a fly is than this primitive worm. And it turns out the fruit fly has only 14,000 genes. Well, this threw a monkey wrench in the belief right away. How can you go up higher up the scale and end up with less genes? But the biggest monkey wrench, as I mentioned, is when we got to the top of the tree and found that humans have 19,000 genes, essentially the same number of genes as the most primitive worm that we studied in our laboratory. And all of a sudden it says then our belief that complexity in life is due to genes is totally false. So it doesn't come from the genes. And now we have to understand, where is evolution coming from? It's not coming from the genes. There's something else. And it's interesting because back in 1809, 50 years before Charles Darwin wrote on the origin of species, the first and more accurate literature on the nature of evolution was published by a scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck studied evolution and wrote the story of an evolution of hierarchy from primitive organisms to more complex organisms. But his theory was a little different than Darwin's theory, because Lamarck's theory was not based on genes, but it was based on an interaction of organisms and the environment in which they live. He said organisms and environment have a lockstep interaction. You don't find polar bears in the tropics. You don't find orchids in the Arctic. Every organism fits in its environment, and that's what he keyed into. And it was so important because in his story of evolution, it wasn't based on genes. They didn't even know about genes then. He based it on the nervous system. He said if you look at the evolution based on the development of the nervous system, you can get an accurate understanding of the ascension from primitive organisms up to humans with ever-increasing development of the nervous system and not related to the genes. So this is a future that we have to look into and go back to the original story of Lamarck, because Lamarck's story, although called as a joke by modern scientists, in the recent unfolding of new science in the wake of the Human Genome Project, Lamarck is coming back into the scientific reality of having the most profound insight. How an organism responds to the environment will determine the fate and characteristic of that organism. And this is the information that will take us into the understanding of the biology of belief. The results of the Human Genome Project threw a giant monkey wrench into conventional science because it revealed that genes were really not the source of control of what was going on in our biology. There were just too few of them to account for that. So the whole concept of the medical model as humans being biochemical machines being controlled by genes, well, this is a totally false statement. And it's interesting because this false statement reveals that our belief system in medicine of working with the genes as the source of the character and control of life was misleading us and taking us on the wrong path. It's very interesting that in the Journal of the American Medical Association, Dr. Barbara Starfield wrote an article that revealed that medicine, allopathic conventional medicine, is the third leading cause of death in the United States, and this was based on conservative numbers. What is really relevant about it is this. The fact that they're not performing well really reflects the fact that they are misunderstanding the nature of science. And this is why this healing art has actually become so lethal. So this is a wonderful opportunity with the results of the Genome Project to found a new and better, more holistic science that can help us. And toward this end, we have to recognize that what's happening on our planet today, what we started with, the Anthropocene character of humans destroying the civilization, actually has to do with human behavior. And that we're beginning to find out that our behavior is not in alignment with nature. And so if we want to move forward into our world, we have to use the wisdom of Albert Einstein to understand this. You cannot solve the problems with the same thinking that created the problems. So in our civilization today, as we're facing extinction because of human behavior, we have to recognize that we are responsible and our beliefs and our behaviors are contributing to this extinction. In this regard, I really would like to list what I call the 4 assumptions of the apocalypse. These are 4 assumptions that we bought into as being scientifically accurate and have built a culture on these beliefs. And so I'll just list them as number one. I call them myth perceptions. That's not a lisp. These are myths that we bought into and are running our lives with these, and now find that these myths are scientifically invalid. Myth number one is simply the concept that biological processes employ Newtonian physics. The relevance of that myth is simply this. In a Newtonian world, we only study the material physical plane and totally ignore the invisible realm, the energy, the spirit. That aspect is not part of our conventional science. What's interesting about that is in only studying the physical realm, this is no longer part of real science, for a new science has come in. The new science is called quantum physics. And quantum physics doesn't remove Newtonian physics. Quantum physics is a much larger science. Newtonian physics is only a small piece of quantum physics. So quantum physics is the overriding science. And what do we find out from quantum physics, as we'll go into in depth? That everything is made out of energy. Everything you think is matter is actually energy. And why is that relevant? Because what appears to be matter, that form of energy, is also connected to all the other forms of energy. So when you leave energy, the environmental energy, out of an equation, then you're missing a very important component that determines the quality and character of our lives. So we have to add a quantum physics perspective to our science to bring it up to date. Myth perception number two is the continuing belief, especially held by the public, that genes control our biology. Well, this turns out to be totally false. And I so look forward to talking about this in a subsequent section. And the significance is there's a new science of heredity that is called epigenetics. And epigenetics, it sounds like genetics, is a revolution that will transform civilization on this planet. Just that belief alone is a revolution. But there are two other beliefs that we bought into that are also affecting our drive toward extinction. And these two beliefs are directly connected to Darwinian theory. So myth perception number three is the belief called survival of the fittest. And the significance of the survival of the fittest is that it gives us a world based on competition, that everyone is driven to not be at the bottom, to be somewhere in the safe zone. So it's a race against each other, a competitive battle. And the significance of competition is that at one level, competition might be peaceful, but competition can easily turn violence, and competition can easily turn into war. And so what we're seeing on this world stage today is a lot of violence that is then covered up by saying, oh, that's just due to the survival of the fittest, that's just nature and life. And the fact is, no, it's not. Because we now know that evolution is not based on competition. Evolution is based on cooperation. A garden is not a battle zone. A garden is a cooperative community. And we are supposed to be part of that garden. And unfortunately, in our world, in our striving for fitness and competition, we have actually destroyed the garden from which we come. So it's not survival of the fittest. I make up my own word in this case. It's the survival of the fittingest. Those that are most capable of adapting to the existing environment and the existing organisms on this planet will be encouraged to survive. Those that challenge the existing structure will be facing extinction, and that's where human civilization is at this particular moment. The last misperception number four, again, a variation based on Darwinian theory, is this. According to conventional Darwinian theory, the neo-Darwinian theory, the new version of it based on a molecular insight that Darwin didn't have, we see that random mutations are the first step in an evolutionary rise, meaning an organism reproduces and one of its offspring has an altered gene, a mutation, changes the characteristic of that organism. And then from that point on, the organism will change itself and its structure and its behavior as it evolves into the environment. So why is it important to emphasize that random processes are not the source of evolution? Because if you understand that, then it says, then there was no purpose for us on this planet, that we just got here by a whole series of accidental mutations, and that purpose is really not relevant to anything. Well, once we disconnect ourselves from the environment, then we actually tread on that environment as if the environment is separate from who we are. We are the environment. We evolved from the environment. We are part of the ecosystem. We didn't get here by accident. We now know there are different kinds of mutations, not random ones, but more or less called beneficial, directed, or adaptive type mutations. These are mutations that actually enhance the viability of an organism. Random mutations almost inevitably cause defects and the loss of an organism because of defective genes. So random mutations are not the real source of the advancement in evolution. We're beginning to find that organisms interact with the environment just as Lamarck suggested, that through this interaction, environmental information is used to adjust the genetics so that the organism can survive in a continuously evolving environment. Therefore, it's important for us to recognize we did not get here by chance. We got here like every other organism. Every organism that nature introduced into the biosphere, she did so because the biosphere was getting out of balance. So you bring in one organism and it throws it out of balance. You bring in another organism to bring the balance back, but then the new organism essentially throws it out of balance. So you bring a third organism and you keep building. Every time you bring in a new organism, it's more powerful in controlling the balance than the previous organism. Now I say, well, what about us? Well, we're at the top of the pile. We are so powerful in controlling the environment that if we lean a little left or a little right, we change the environment in which we live. Without even knowing our job was to bring harmony and balance, and being endowed with this very important power, what have we done? We've leaned left and right to the extent that we have destroyed the environment without even knowing that our mission was to support it, not undermine it. And so the concept of random mutation is misleading us because it really took away purpose from our evolution and our existence. And the last thing, when we buy into the new beliefs, we have to recognize when the new beliefs come in, does that mean all the science that we've accumulated all these years is wrong and that we have to build a whole new science base? The answer is no. To illustrate what I mean, let me show you this figure. This is an optical illusion picture. It looks like, to some people, an old woman, a haggish-looking old woman with a big gaping smile. And to others, they look at the same picture and they see a very young woman looking off in a different direction. So when you look at the picture, in one perspective, it looks like an old woman. In another perspective, it looks like a young woman. So let me just show you, I'll illustrate it for you by taking the picture. What I'll do is I'll put a pair of glasses on the old lady's face so you can see the glasses, her big nose, and the gash of a smile. And I say, okay, now let's take a look at the younger woman in the same picture. So I remove the glasses from the old lady, put on the new glasses in a different way, remove that smile for a second, that gaping smile from the old lady. Now look at the picture. And when you see the picture this time, what you can see is there's a young woman looking off to the right, and you're seeing her profile. So here's the point. The picture can represent either an old woman or the picture can represent a young woman. I said, well, how do I know what the picture really represents? The original artist, when he put this together, I don't think he was thinking, oh, I'm going to draw two ladies in the same picture. He was drawing one picture and the second image came out of it. So the question I would ask is, in the original piece of artwork, did the artist intend the old picture or the young woman's picture? So I say, well, let's do a scientific assessment of that. And when I do, you get this chart. Here are all the bits of data, the ones and the zeros of a scientific assessment of this piece of artwork. And I say, well, look at the image data. Does that image data tell you if it's a young woman or an old woman? And the answer is, I can't tell from the data. And all of a sudden you realize something very important. The same data in a different perspective can give me a different image. And if I change my perspective, I can get another image. So what's important is when you look at the picture, and if you're looking at the old woman, you cannot at the same time see the young woman. What you have to do is change your point of focus and gear into another point of view. So as you then switch to look at the young woman, you're looking at different characteristics, and then all of a sudden the young woman comes out. You cannot see the old woman and the young woman simultaneously. You have to change your points of reference. The relevance is this. The new science we're going to talk about, the new science of epigenetics and the new science of quantum physics, is going to use the exact same data that we already have. What it's going to do is change our point of reference. So we can use the same data, but get an entirely new picture of evolution. And what are we finding with this new picture of evolution? When we go back to our chart, tracing the civilizations that have been here, we see this beautiful piece of a sine wave. And I say, yeah, but where's the next step on the sine wave? Well, here's what we showed. In brief summary, we started off at the midline, with the midline representing spirit and matter in perfect balance. We then started to go into the realm of spirituality through polytheism, then fully into the realm of spirituality with Judeo-monotheism. However, when Darwin's theory started to come in, we left the spiritual realm and dropped into the material realm because Darwin's theory was based on the material nature of a human being or living organisms. And we moved from spirituality toward matter. But we really hit the full matter spectrum, the full realm, in 1953. That's when the DNA double helix revealed this is the bottom line, the physical molecule that provides for life. I said, but after we found the DNA, we engaged in the Human Genome Project. And if you look at the chart, in 2003, when the Human Genome Project results were revealed, we see our curve moving back from matter toward spirituality again. We're moving back up toward the midline. And what's interesting is that as we continue this story, what we're going to find is, if you see the pattern, we are moving back to the midline for the third time. And the midline is the most important line of all, because the midline is perfect balance again. And so our destination is not to go back into the spiritual realm, it's to come back to the point where spirit and matter meet. That is the midline. It'll create a new civilization. Why? Because the beliefs of the existing situation, the paradigm beliefs, the ones that characterize Judeo-Christian monotheism and then later scientific materialism, these beliefs, which ones are we in now? Scientific beliefs. We got here through random mutations, that there's no purpose for human existence, and that life is a struggle for survival. And guess what? The answers to those questions have now changed. There's a new science. And I say, what's the relevance? Every time the answers to the paradigm questions change, civilization, the old one ends and a new one begins. So what does it mean? We are on the cusp of creating a new civilization right now with new beliefs as the old ones are dropping out. And these new beliefs take us back to the midline. These beliefs in the quantum biophysics, the epigenetics, the nature of being adaptive mutations to fit into the world, and the characteristic that life is not competition, changes how we live on this planet. So what we're seeing is we're moving into a new world. And this is the new world that we can thrive into.